Good evening, everyone. Welcome from sunny West London, I think, this evening. It's a bit cold, but hopefully we're waiting for some warmer spring weather. My name's Paul Dryborough. I'm currently chair of the British Association for Local History, and it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's lecture. This is the third in our now annual series of collaborative lectures with the Historic Towns Trust. And I hope you've been enjoying the previous two lectures in the series and the previous 2 years. Tonight's lecture promises to be really interesting, even if I must admit I'm from the wrong side of the Humber, maybe for Emily to correct me on later. But I'm now going to hand over to actually take you through the proceedings to Professor Vanessa Harding, who is the current chair of the Historic Towns Trust. And I just want to thank Vanessa and everybody at the Historic Towns Trust for the brilliant way that we've collaborated together on these lectures, and also for the programme of speakers that you provided over the last 3 years. So Vanessa, I will now turn off and hand over to you. Evening,
Thank
everyone.
you very much indeed for that introduction, Paul. You said what I was going to say, that this is the third in this ongoing collaboration, in this year's lectures and this ongoing collaboration, which we're very pleased indeed to be participating with. I'm here to introduce tonight's speaker, who is Emily Robinson, who is Reader in British Studies at the University of Sussex. Now, although most of what Emily's written and published so far has been in the modern or indeed contemporary British history, there's a thread running through it, which is about understandings of history, the politics of feeling, about storytelling. And for this talk and for what she's doing at the moment, she's moving back a long way in time. Now, Emily and I first met when she contacted the Historic Towns Trust to ask about using our map of Hull, which we published in 2017 in an exhibition she's curating. And this exhibition, which is on Hull and on Ravenser Odd, Twin Cities' Sunken Pasts, is currently on at the Hull History Centre until the 30th of May. And and I gather it's being very successful, very popular. And it's the second part of that exhibition theme that she's going to be talking about today, which her title is Local Histories of a Lost Town, Researching the Island of Ravenser Odd. She will explain absolutely everything about that. I have to say I'd hardly heard of it before this moment, or before we started talking about doing this talk. But obviously very interested, very much looking forward to what you're going to say. So Emily, over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and Paul. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to do this talk. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. Before we get started, I just wanted to say that the exhibition, which Vanessa very kindly mentioned, I'm co-curating it with a colleague, Dr. Catherine Maud, who is a medieval specialist at the National Archives. This is a picture of her on our recent trip to Spurn Point together. And she wanted me to point out that she's not actually just looking away from the sea. She's actually looking across the estuary across the point of Spurn Point to the other side of the coastline, the estuary side, which is one of the kind of supposed sites of Ravenser Odd. Now, unfortunately, Kath couldn't be here this evening because quite glamorously, she's in Bruges recording a documentary about Queen Emma, who was Canute's wife. But this talk is based as much on her work as it is on mine. So I wanted to start with her. So the exhibition that we've put together tells the story of these two towns, which both became royal boroughs on the same day, the 1st of April, 1299, Hull and Ravenser Odd. And while I hope that most people here are pretty familiar with Hull, perhaps they've even been there, I suspect rather fewer are familiar with Ravenser Odd, and certainly none will have visited. It's a lost town, an island that existed for just 130 years in medieval East Yorkshire, near or perhaps even on the site, which is now Spurn Point. It seems to have appeared from a sort of accumulation of eroded land from further up the coast, sometime in the kind of mid-1230s, and it was settled and developed astonishingly quickly. So it became powerful and wealthy enough to get a royal charter within 70 years, but then it deteriorated even faster. So by the end of the 1350s, we think there was pretty much nothing left. And even its story seems to have largely sunk with it, leaving just administrative documents and a single narrative account in the chronicle of the nearby Mew Abbey. So it's mentioned in passing in early antiquarian studies, and I will say a bit more about those in a moment. But these sources don't really seem to have cohered into a clear account of it as a kind of specific place in its own right until the 19th century. Since then, though, it's been the subject of various local historical studies throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and then increasing numbers of blogs and news stories in the early 21st. So these often repeat a handful of the kind of established kind of facts about the place, which have varying degrees of accuracy, but they've accumulated around the story. They often focus on its reputation as a pirate town and on its intriguing name, which is often described as being a Viking remnant, supposedly meaning the raven's tongue of land, although I'm not quite sure how accurate that is. But this evening, I want to think about the challenges and also the attractions of telling the local history of a place that no longer exists. And I also want to think about how a sense of loss, I think, has really shaped the way that Ravenser Odd's past has been imagined, in contrast to its neighbour Hull, which went on not only to survive, but to prosper. So although only a tiny part of medieval Hull survives, with the rest being lost to Dockland development in the 19th century and then catastrophically heavy bombing in the 20th, we can still trace its outlines beneath the shape of the contemporary city, which is why I was in touch with Vanessa about being able to show this map as part of the exhibition. So we can look at this map and we can say, you know, this is where William Delapol's house stood, this is where the city walls ran. We also have poll tax records, and we can match them with the shape of the streets. So I think I'm right in saying, Kath assures me on this, that all of the streets named on the 1377 poll tax returns are still standing, and some even have the same names, like Blackfriar Gate. So these tracings are in the Hull History Centre archive, and I think that they were prepared by Rosemary Horrocks for her 1978 book, The Changing Plan of Hull, from which I've taken the diagram shown here on the right. But there's nothing similar for Ravenser Odd. We can't even say where the island was, whether it stood to the east of the current Spurn Point or to the west, whether it was in the River Humber or in the North Sea. Indeed, this is something of a contentious issue, as we can see reflected in the titles of these two 19th century books. So on the one hand, we have Lost Towns of the Humber, and on the other, Lost Towns of the Yorkshire coast. And that second title was quite a sort of pointed jab at the first, as well as in the maps they include. The medieval sources are quite ambiguous about this geography. So the Mew Abbey Chronicle says that Ravenser Odd was between the waters of the sea and those of the Humber, that it was distant from the mainland a space of a mile or more, and that it was joined to the mainland by a sandy road. Whereas in the 1270s, locals had described it clearly as an island, specifying that the sea surrounds it. And in a slightly later court case, it's also described as a small island which was born of the sea, the space of one tide from Grimsby. And while it does appear on one contemporary map that we found so far, an Italian navigation chart, this is not sufficiently detailed to help us to answer these questions. It was designed to help sailors navigate the coastline. So what matters is the list of ports in the order they would encounter them. And as with many medieval maps, it's drawn with the south at the top. So I've turned it round so that on the left-hand side, you can see the sort of shape of England as we would recognise it. And then the text turned upside down, you can see Ravenser Odd and Hull. So the earliest detailed maps that we have of the Humber and the Spurn Peninsula are these from the 16th century. And I think it's really striking the way that they kind of very much focus on the sandbanks. So this was around the time that the Humber pilots began to navigate the river, accompanying ships that might otherwise find themselves stranded. But unfortunately, the maps do not mark the site of where Ravenser Odd had stood, and this remains unknown. Indeed, in 1959, the Deserted Medieval Villages Research Group, whose work I'm going to come back to later, declined the opportunity to excavate the site on the grounds that they wouldn't know where to begin looking. And I think what's quite interesting is that this physical uncertainty means that historical research into the island has often been conducted by geographers who want to understand the evolution of this quite peculiar peninsula, which continues to shift and change and may yet become an island once again. And maps, including these ones, and medieval texts like the ones I've just mentioned, frequently appear in their sort of quite scientific reports. So in the 1960s, George de Boer of the University of Hull used them to propose that the point shifted on a 250-year cycle. This theory has been challenged at various times, most notably by John Pethick in his various writings since the 1990s. He suggested that the 18th century reclamation of Sunk Island, which is a little bit further along the river, had changed the tidal flows in ways that de Boer had not accounted for. But in all of this, the location of Ravenser Odd matters. So, I've put this 2018 Spurn Geomorphological Assessment document here, which was a report to Natural England. It has a whole section on Ravenser Odd and where it might have been, with quotations from the medieval documents. And as Kath and I have been working on this project, we've often been asked where we think the island was. And the truth is that we don't know. Neither of us are geographers, so we've studiously avoided taking a line on this. But what I do find really interesting is the way that kind of necessarily historical and geographical studies have overlapped. So I found a set of research notes from the 1990s from the Victoria County History for the East Riding, which I think were written, the book was edited by Keith Allison, and I think they're his notes, although they could perhaps have been one of his correspondents, but commenting on George de Boer's work and asking the question, quote, should so much precision be attributed to distances given in the Mew Chronicle? Which is exactly the question that Kath and I have been asking ourselves. But it's this use of such sources by scientists, geomorphologists, in the case of de Boer and Pethick, that I find really interesting. And this continues. So you might have heard about the ongoing search for the remains of the town. Since 2021, a team of sedimentologists from the University of Hull have been scanning the seabed, again in an effort to better understand the changing geography of the area. But I think one of the really striking things about this is that it seems to have been driven by the efforts and the enthusiasm of a local historian, Phil Matheson. So Phil published a popular book in 2015, which drew together details from previous historical studies of Ravenser Odd, and also put forward his own theory about where the island might have stood. And this was part of a wave of kind of new interest in this history, which seems to have begun with history blogs in the mid-2000s, some of which are no longer online, while others continue to be very influential. And they vary a great deal in tone and content. So some, like the one by Dr. Caitlin Green, are very scholarly. So she's an expert in both medieval history and archaeology. But others are a bit more whimsical. So this last one on the list, Voices in the Attic, that was a sort of collection of spooky stories written by college students in Canada. I've yet to talk to them and find out how they came across this story in particular. But we've seen a sort of rapidly growing creative engagement with this story. So in the past few years, it's inspired at least 4 novels and many poems and short stories. Its name has been borrowed by 5 bands that I know of, and a US-based film production company. It's appeared in role-play scenarios and computer games, and a board game is in development. There's a set of highly sought-after limited edition ghosts of Ravenser Odd, and various visual artists have made works inspired by its story. There have also been 2 street theatre versions and a virtual reality stage show. And that's just what I know about. So every time I give a talk like this, I meet more people who have written stories and poems, or who are working on novels and scripts. It seems to be growing exponentially. And I'm really interested in the sort of different ways that people are approaching and using this history. So for some, it's very much a local story. It's of interest because of its location, whether that is East Yorkshire in general or Spurn Point in particular. This is an often neglected area of the country, and recovering its history is important to many people for that reason. So it's a way of challenging misperceptions and part of the wider rediscovery of the heritage of Hull and its surrounding area. not least through the Heritage Lottery funded Hull Maritime project, which is trying, as it says here, to change hearts and minds about the city and its hinterland by recovering its heritage. And I think it's no coincidence that public interest in Ravenser Odd seems to have begun to grow around the time that Hull was UK City of Culture in 2017. So I'm from the area myself, and I first heard of it in a Guardian article about Hull around that time. But this, I don't think, is a homogeneous picture. So for many artists and writers, even some of those who do have local or relatively local roots, the story of Ravenser Odd is attractive because it's weird, because it's unusual, and it's, you know, odd. And while the eeriness of this kind of specific landscape with its roll call of lost villages matters, it's also something of an archetype. It evokes other places, from Dunwich to Capel Cailin, as well as those comparisons suggest, other times. So one US writer that I spoke to, he noted that yes, it matters that it's sort of rooted in a specific time and place, that gives it this ring of authenticity. But from his point of view, it doesn't really matter whether that is medieval Yorkshire or Hanoverian Scotland. That was the comparison he drew. So it's this slippage, I think, between the particular and the archetypal. And more specifically, I think, between the history of place and the mystery of absence that I want to think about this evening. And of course, I think in many ways, this is kind of at the heart of the whole enterprise, right, of historical research at all, but perhaps of local history in particular. The interest is always, I think, at least partly based on the contrast between what is and what was. And the Historic Towns Trust maps, for instance, I think are fascinating because of the way they layer time over space. So I spent the past few weeks watching people move around our exhibition, and I've seen the way that they're drawn to this, how they kind of slowly work out what it's showing them, and then begin to look for the landmarks that they know and to add on this new historical information to their existing images of those places. And the way that we read history through the places around us is one of the attractions of local history, going right back to the early antiquarianism of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and its reckoning with the ruptures of the Reformation. But one of the things I'm starting to wonder about is whether this emphasis on place, on the physical traces of the past that we can see in antiquities and in ruins, might have worked against historical interest in Ravenser Odd. So for instance, when the antiquarian John Leyland described the area in the 16th century, he noted the decline of nearby Heddon, saying that where it had in Edward III's days many good ships and rich merchants, now there be but a few boats and no merchants of any estimation. The truth is that when Hull began to flourish, Heddon decayed. But according to contemporary sources, it wasn't only Hull that was rivaling Heddon, but also Ravenser Odd. So both were good towns which have good harbours and grow day by day, and both were pulling people away from Heddon. But by the time that this map was produced in the late 13th century, Ravenser Odd was no longer part of the local landscape. It's not pictured. And it seems by the time that Leyland was writing, a century and a half later, to have disappeared from cultural consciousness altogether, although he did include its later namesake Raven Spur as part of his geographical description of how the Humber meets the sea. In his 1727 journey through the whole island of Great Britain, Daniel Defoe remarked of Spurn Point that although the long promontory thrusting out into the sea was a remarkable thing, it was not really of interest to him. And he added, the most that I find remarkable here is that there is nothing remarkable upon this side for above 30 miles together, not a port, not a gentleman's seat, not a town of note. And perhaps this shouldn't be surprising because Defoe claimed not to be interested in antiquities. But just 2 paragraphs earlier, he had really excitedly recounted the story of Michael Delapole, which he described as a piece of honour to Hull, recounting how Delapole had been a merchant of Hull, but first at a place called Ravensroot in Brabant, where, growing rich, he advanced to King Richard II several £1,000s in gold. Now, Defoe's writing is notoriously inaccurate, so I don't think we should place too much emphasis on this, right? He gets the wrong king and he gets the wrong Delapole. And this whole story is then corrected in later editions that were edited by Samuel Richardson. But I do think it's interesting that Defoe seems to find it easier to imagine this kind of fictional origin story in this foreign Ravensrud, which I think must be an amalgam of a town called Ravenstein, which is in the Netherlands, and Antwerp, where William de la Pole was sent and detained on royal business, though not where he made his money, than it is for him to imagine a port and a town of note in the Humber estuary. And to be honest, I can understand why. Visiting this place now, and this is the site where it's most likely thought to be where Ravenser Odd was, it's impossible to imagine a kind of bustling town. In the early 19th century, Thomas Thompson explained this in his study of Holderness and Ravenspurn, which he treats as kind of the same place as Ravenser Odd. So he said, modern memory and observation can render no assistance in an attempt to give a history of the long-lost maritime town of Ravenspurn in Holderness. And where all evidence is to be drawn from ancient records, neither numerous nor generally accessible, it's only by a careful collection of scattered facts that a faint representation can be given of a place which has had no local existence for many generations. And then he cites Ovid. I'm not going to read the Latin, but it means now corn grows where Troy once stood. And he adds, but the patient antiquary in his travels in Holderness may sit on the banks of the Humber and watch the ebbing of the tide without being able to discern a blade of grass where once stood the market town and seaport of Ravenspurn. So in an age of topographical work, there was no topos, no place to write about. And yet, Thomson's careful collection of scattered facts proved more fruitful than he anticipated, so much so that he was unable to fit it into his pamphlet and he had to write another. As he found, Ravenser Odd left a surprisingly large collection of historical documents. Because it was a royal borough, its records were kept centrally, and so they outlived the island itself. So we have its manorial accounts, we have letters between the king and the burgesses, and from the king on behalf of the burgesses to foreign rulers, many of which had been gathered into a sort of collected volume of royal correspondence in the early 18th century, which Thomson consulted. We have wills, we have post-mortem property valuations, and we have royal inquiries into both the conduct of its citizens and the state of its flood defences. And I think it's perhaps no accident that more detailed studies of Ravenser Odd coincided with the opening of the Public Record Office. So in the 1860s, the antiquarian and expert in foreshore law, Stuart Moore, translated a great many of the original documents as part of his work on a legal case about the Constable family's right, or otherwise, to sell gravel from the Spurn foreshore. And in 1889, Hull archivist and historian J.R. Boyle published his Lost Towns of the Humber, which also contains a great many translations and transcriptions from what was then the Public Record Office. So before I met Kath, who, unlike me, can read medieval Latin, I was entirely dependent on the works of these writers and those who came after them. But now I'm fortunate enough to be able to depend on her. And she's been continuing to go through the documents which are held at the National Archives now, and is gathering a really detailed picture of life on the island. So for instance, she's been going through the manorial accounts. On the left of the screen, this is an example, and you can see in the middle where it says Ravenser Odd, and I don't know if you can sort of see at this distance, but the R has been drawn into a little face. So particularly like this example. And these tell us how much money was coming in from different sources. She's put together this chart showing the manorial accounts from a particular year, 1268 to 9, with the x-axis representing money in pence. And from that, we can see that the biggest income that year was from boat tolls, with rent for property a close second. We can also see that the island had 4 pence worth of pasture to sell, as well as a windmill and a tannery. So we do know an awful lot about Ravenser Odd. And yet, for some reason, that seems to make it kind of harder rather than easier to imagine. And so it continues to be thought of as this sort of mysterious place, interesting because it's lost, and because of the emptiness of the current landscape of Spurn. It is quite eerie. It's this sort of liminal space, not quite land or water, and devoid of human habitation. Although it's only actually in the past few years that the last inhabitants, the lifeboat crews and their families, have vacated the site. But from 1890 to 1945, there was even a school there. But I think if now this is a place marked by its solitude, in a time of sea travel, it would have been very different. The Humber was and remains an extremely important trade route. So wool and other goods would have been transported down the River Hull, down the Ouse and the Trent, and then loaded onto large ocean-going ships to sail along the Humber and out into the Low Countries, into the Baltic, to Scandinavia. And then back in the other direction came furs and skins and manufactured cloth and grain, as well as wine from Italy and France. So being placed at this very kind of edge point then was an advantage. So we shouldn't think of this peninsula as isolated, but as the centre of an international maritime network. And the port of Ravenser Odd was better placed for this than Hull or Hedon or Grimsby. Indeed, some of the records we have are complaints about this. So in the 100 rolls of the 1270s, for instance, people from neighbouring towns complained that the bailiff of the local landowner, who at the time was the woman Isabella de Fortibus, was building a port that was harming the existing local ports, as well as doing things like charging tolls on fishing. Interestingly, they also said that the island was already acting like a borough, exercising rights that it shouldn't have. So seizing people's goods if they didn't pay their debts and holding a court that it wasn't entitled to. And this might sound just like sort of disgruntled neighbours complaining, but we do know from the manorial accounts that the Countess was bringing in a lot of money from this court. In fact, it was Ravenser Odd's most profitable activity at this time. So one of the most often told stories about Ravenser Odd is that in 1291, the people of Grimsby took the islanders to court, alleging that they were intercepting ships on their way to Grimsby and forcing them to dock at Ravenser Odd instead. The people of Grimsby complained about the grievances and injuries done to the men of Grimsby and said that their town had been much deteriorated and was being impoverished by this behaviour. Now, the court did not find in Grimsby's favour, and its burgesses had to pay a fine for bringing a false accusation. Now, this case stands out because it went to the Court of King's Bench, so the highest court in the land, but it was not unusual in its accusations of wrongdoing on the sea. So in 1295, King Eric II of Norway wrote to Edward I to complain that the ship of one of his subjects, a man named Conrad, had been wrecked on the shore near Ravenser, and that the islanders had stolen the goods. They had taken 250 silver marks, 2 gold marks, and 25 sacks of prepared wool. And there is no record of a follow-up by King Edward, so we don't know whether poor Conrad got his money back or not. Later, during the Great Famine of the early 14th century, a merchant from Almain complained that men from the region had boarded a ship that was bringing goods from Germany. They'd killed its captain, thrown the crew overboard, and then sold the goods to collaborators at Ravenser Odd. And it's because of cases like this that Ravenser Odd has gained the reputation of being a pirate town. But as we've seen, it was found innocent in the Grimsby case. The ruling was that the people had not broken the king's peace. They were just more successful traders than Grimsby. And also, in the court records, the people of Ravenser Odd said that Grimsby's merchants were not paying fair prices for fish, so it was no surprise that people didn't want to land there. And also, while stealing shipwrecked goods was illegal, or shipwrecked goods belonged to the king, it was not piracy. It's also clear that Ravenser Odd's behaviour was not at all unusual. So its merchants brought various accusations of their own about alleged pirate attacks by sailors from various cities in the modern-day Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. This letter is from the burgesses of Ravenser Odd to Edward II and tells the story of William, a Ravenser man, who had loaded his ship with goods and was travelling home. Again, this is during the time of famine, when certain evildoers and pirates, and I've circled where it says evildoers and pirates, in the power of the court of Zeeland, which is in the modern-day Netherlands, attacked the ship on the coast of the sea near Flushing. They killed William, and his crewmates fled in fear. The pirates then took the goods and food found in the ship to the value of £60 sterling. So accusations of piracy like these seem to have been a normal part of trading relations, and they often reflected the changing international situation. So in one case, the king wrote to the people of Ravenser Odd, instructing them to return a ship that had been seized from a Dutch merchant, but only because it was discovered that it had been taken before the Count of Holland had changed sides and joined forces with France against England. If the ship had been taken slightly later, at the time when the king was actually writing, then it would have been legitimate spoils of war, and they would have been serving the king's interests. Indeed, he'd already granted the ship to a man from Grimsby before he realised that the timing was wrong and it would have to be returned. And neither were these cases unusual by local standards. So closer to home, a man described as a Hull merchant, Robert Rottenherring, whose name means red herring, unfortunately not rotten, was accused of attacking a boat and its crew, then selling the stolen corn in Hull. So very similar to the Almain case. And yet, we do not tend to think of medieval Hull as a pirate town in the way that Ravenser Odd has become known. But these two places were really similar at the time. Not only did they get their charters on the same day, but there seems to have been a great deal of interaction and exchange between their burgesses. So several held land in both places. The Rottenherrings were one example, and indeed Robert Rottenherring was himself described as a merchant of Ravenser rather than Hull in the 1330s. Alexander Cox, another merchant living on Ravenser Odd, left, quote, all his tenements in Kingston upon Hull and a place in Ravenser Odd to his son Peter in his will. And after Ravenser Odd flooded, many of its inhabitants moved to Hull. The Cathars also traced one who moved to Calais and opened a pub. The records from the 1377 poll tax of Hull, for instance, show that William of Ravenser and John of Ravenser and his wife were now living there. And while we don't have physical remains of Ravenser Odd itself, I think we can perhaps trace its outlines in the surviving fabric of medieval Hull. So for instance, Hull Minster, formerly Holy Trinity Church, has a chantry founded by wool merchant and mayor of Hull, Richard de Selby, and his brother-in-law, Richard Ravenser, who became Archdeacon of Lincoln. And we think it's likely that these effigies on a nearby tomb show de Selby and his wife, Emma Ravenser. Both families can be traced to Ravenser Odd, and there are also chantries for the Rottenherring and the Delapole families. So the Delapoles left a particularly significant mark on Hull. William became its first mayor, followed by his brother, and they funded a great deal of the town's early development. And it seems likely that at least some of the money to do this came partly from Ravenser Odd, not from Brabant, as Defoe suggested. The Mute Abbey Chronicle says that William was, quote, instructed at Ravenser Odd in the knowledge of merchandise. And this is apt because the Delapole family appeared apparently from nowhere and went on to become extremely rich and powerful, just like the island itself. And the similarity between Ravenser Odd and Hull has been emphasised by the historian Maurice Beresford, perhaps best known for his work on deserted medieval villages, including his long-term and pioneering work at Warren Percy. Beresford also carried out a great deal of research into Ravenser Odd, but it was not because it was a deserted settlement that it appears in his work, but rather because it was a new town. So one of the many sort of deliberate plantations of England, Wales and Gascony that he was writing about. So in a 1957 book where he was sort of showing a method of bringing together documentary sources with the physical evidence of the surviving landscape, he included Ravenser Odd as one of his 3 model new towns, despite the impossibility of walking its footprint. And much like Thomas Thompson in the 19th century, he regretfully noted that, quote, a visit to Ravenser Odd is not possible. It has been under the sea for nearly 600 years. One can only stand on the desolate shore of Spurn Head and look westwards into the estuary towards the traditional site. He also suggested, as we see here, that Heddon was the best model for understanding how both medieval Hull and Ravenser Odd might have looked because of the way its 13th century street plan survives. So Beresford was looking at the landscape and the surviving traces of medieval streets because we don't have drawn street plans for that period. Medieval maps tended to serve very different purposes. At a grand scale, they might set out mythological visions of the world and its history with that very specific political and theological intent. So thinking of something like the Hereford Mappa Mundi. But they might also be working documents, whether navigation charts. So this is the sort of bigger view of the chart that I showed earlier, or land maps of areas under legal dispute. The other image here on the right is the Inklesmoor map, which shows the moors at the other end of the Humber, because they were at the centre of a dispute between St Mary's Abbey and the Duchy of Lancaster about the right to cut peat on the moorland. Or at the very small scale, we might have working plans of individual buildings. So we don't have street plans of Ravenser Odd, and we also don't have physical remains, but we do have documentary evidence, which a local artist, Gareth Slatehome, has been using to imagine what it might have looked like. And many of these documentary sources come from the time of the town's destruction, and they suggest that it was pretty large. So for instance, we know that one woman, Cecily de Selby, lost 145 houses there in a storm. And we don't even know if this was the full extent of her property, because it's only listing what's been destroyed. The records suggest that 200 houses plus many more were destroyed in that particular storm, and that this was only 2 parts of the town. But it doesn't specify how many parts there had been. We're kind of assuming it's probably 2/3. So it seems likely that at its peak, there were at least 300 houses and upwards of 1,000 people. And from the manorial accounts that I mentioned earlier, we know that there were 2 windmills, a tannery, a goldsmith's, a busy courthouse, a prison, as well as a stone church. These documents also tell us about how the end of the island came about. So from 1329 and throughout the 1330s and 40s, the islanders repeatedly petitioned the king for money for flood defences and for tax exemptions, because so many taxpayers were leaving. And the king sent investigators who confirmed these claims in 1343 and again in 1346. I should point out here that I've just used this picture because it looks nice, but it is, that's of 18th century Germany. It's not actually a picture of Ravenser Odd. But on the latter date, 1346, only 1/3 of the inhabitants were left. They could no longer pay the taxes that the king demanded. So he ordered that the tax burden should be reduced. And there are 2 further documents that confirm the island's destruction. The first is a post-mortem inquisition. And the reason it's shown blue here is because it's quite difficult to read. So it's been sort of looked at under UV light, which helps make it clearer. So in 1352, a man named Peter Cock had died. His daughter, another Cecily, was ready to inherit his property. But according to the Inquisition, by 1354, his property on Ravenser had been, quote, wasted by the tides of the sea and the Humber, and was annihilated by the sea. So Cecily got nothing. The second record is this manorial account document. So it's from the same series that I spoke about earlier. It lists annual expenses and income from different places within a larger estate. So down the left-hand side of the document, we can see a list of place names, and then beside each name, the accounts are written out. So in this piece, we can see the place names are Wildfleet, Potterfleet, Staneth, and Ravenser Odd. And the first 3, we can see the accounts written out beside them, but Ravenser Odd just has a blank space, presumably because by this time it had no economic activity, and then it doesn't appear again in the manorial accounts after that date. And this, I'm really pleased to say, is one of the original documents that we were able to take from the National Archives to Hull. So it's on display there until the end of May. So one of the reasons, I think it's really obvious why Maurice Beresford was not interested in Ravenser Odd as an example of a deserted settlement is because there's no mystery here. There's no kind of historical question to answer. We know exactly why people left. But as his work makes clear, what's more interesting, what's more sort of difficult to explain, I think, is its foundation. There's a lot more intrigue there. How did it come to be? So just sticking with the end, this is the Mew Abbey Chronicle with its sort of graphic and almost gleeful description of the repeated flooding of the island. It said that in 1355, the chapel at Ravenser Odd was, quote, destroyed to its foundations, and that the corpses and bones of the dead there buried horribly appeared. Now, that's not to say that this was straightforwardly fact. Chronicles were also written for a purpose, and in this case, several decades after the events in question. And it's also worth noting that the monks of Mew had themselves lost land on Ravenser Odd, so might have had cause for grievance. Indeed, the chronicle goes on to suggest that this grisly spectacle and the downfall of the prosperous town had served that exceedingly famous borough right because it provoked the wrath of God against itself beyond measure by its wrongdoing on the sea and its wicked works and piracies. And at the moment, I'm trying to trace the various bits of folklore around this, particularly a story that the bodies from Ravenser Odd were reburied in Easington, which is a nearby village on the mainland, and that the church bell from Ravenser Odd also now hangs there. As with most things in this story, this is a case of tracing references back through documents. But there's also a sort of tantalizing possibility that a story could also be told through physical remnants. So Andrew Gibson, who is the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust ranger at Spurn Point, found this stone near the site where the Hull University search team are looking for the remains of the town. And that team are now talking about having it tested and compared with the stonework of Easington Church to see whether first of all, whether this could have been from that time, but also whether other stones might have been taken from there and used in the church. And I think it's the lack of a sort of concrete presence of Ravenser Odd that naturally invites speculation and mystery solving. Right? This is part of the attraction. We all love a mystery. We want to find that one clue that helps us to think where it might have been. And I think that's part of the reason why events like our exhibition have been gathering so much popular attention. And it has universal appeal. You know, it's a city lost under the sea. Unsurprisingly, the media have been calling it the Yorkshire Atlantis. But the part of the story that I'm kind of more interested in is the sort of local folklore surrounding it, and particularly why it hasn't had such a strong sort of presence in collective memory. You know, I'm interested in how this history came to be lost. So a small number of enthusiasts have been working on it for some time, although many of them only came to it later in life. And there are also pockets of knowledge. So for instance, I've heard of school lessons and a school play in Withensea in the 1990s, and possibly an Amdram performance there as well in the 1980s. And various people who we've spoken to who've come to the exhibition have known about this story. They've, heard about it from older relatives, going back into the 60s and beyond. But by far the sort of more common story is what we can see on these postcards here. So huge amounts of local people have said that they had only heard of this story in recent weeks and months. And so I want to know why that was. And it's been particularly lovely to hear from particularly older people, I think, like the one on the bottom here, the lady who says that she heard about it from her granddaughter. People who are hearing about this story from younger generations, particularly if they've been part of our schools project. So one of the things that we've been doing alongside and as part of the exhibition is having local school children from Hull, but also from the village schools in Easington and Patrington, which are local villages, creating a gallery of kind of lost objects that might have come from Ravenser Odd. So we're displaying their pottery, their coins and their manuscripts alongside the corresponding real artifacts of medieval Hull. And we've been hearing from their teachers and their parents about how this is really changing their understandings of place. I think particularly for those from the small villages, even history from Hull can seem very distant. So it's exciting and inspiring to learn about something that happened right here, even if, or perhaps because, we can't say exactly where that was. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Emily. That was really brilliant, really interesting, full of all sorts. I mean, I have lots of questions I'm sure I'd like to ask. Catherine's going to be gathering them up from the chat. But perhaps I could, well, I think the whole, we're all trying to find a lost past, but your lost past is more lost than some. And there is, of course, this fascinating paradox that it's well recorded in written terms, but not in any other sense. That I'm sure you're right to say that that's part of why it becomes so fascinating. So, I mean, my question, and I was once a medievalist too, is to ask about the kind of ships that were using it, or what do we know about the ships that came into Ravenser Odd, or is there anything in the sort of maritime archaeology that would help us understand its role as a trading point better?
Yeah, so we think it was probably sort of Baltic cogs, so quite kind of large merchant ships. And we have names for some of them. You know, they're also they're getting involved. They're often being asked to send ships and men to war with Scotland and to war with France, and also to get involved in kind of policing that. So saying, you know, we're not allowed any goods coming from those countries at this specific time. So, you know, it's quite strategically important, which is partly why Edward wants to acquire it. So yeah, it's kind of pretty large merchant ships, but there's also a lot of fishing going on. And one of the sort of stories that is told at the time about how it's founded is that it starts because local fishermen start sort of drying their nets there, and eventually begin to sort of trade with passing ships. But a sort of slightly more dramatic story, which is told, that these are both told in the Grimsby court case, is that there's a shipwreck, and somebody, and we don't know, it's not clear whether it's the person whose ship was wrecked or a local person sort of coming from the mainland, kind of illegally acquires the ship and makes it into a house and starts living in it and trading from it, and that's sort of the foundation of the town. But I'm not sure how sort of how much we can say like it was one person, but that's certainly sort of captured a lot of people's imagination.
It certainly sounds as though there was a lot going on. I mean, that it was busy, active, and lots of engagement with the outside world or the rest of the world. Yeah.
Yes, I think so. I mean, so Kath and I went to Span Point last week, and we were standing there sort of watching a ferry go past, and we were thinking, you know, when these, so what the Grimsby merchants complain about is that people are sort of going out in these little boats and intercepting large ships and forcing them to come to port. And we were sort of wondering, you know, how many would there have been on the sea at any one time? Is it a case of sort of there are loads and you're just kind of picking the one that looks most vulnerable, or do you wait for ages for one to come along? And I guess they would have had to wait for the tides to be right anyway, so they probably would have been multiple at the same time. But also because of the sandbanks, we know that it has a port, but we don't know sort of what that means in terms of, like, a large boat presumably couldn't get up close on the sandbank. So yeah, there were a lot of questions. And basically I need to talk to some local fishermen and find out how it works.
Catherine, have we got some questions from sorry, Danny, isn't it? Beg your pardon.
That's all good. Hi everyone, I'm Danny. I am one of the BLH trustees, and I'm going to be chairing the question and answer session for the rest of this talk. Just to let you know, we do have a Q&A function on Zoom, so please pop your questions in there. You can do so in the chat, but yeah, do try to pop your questions there. And I can already see from the Q&A and from the chat, there's some questions, there's some messages, which is great. And we'll give people some time to kind of mull over what you've been saying, Emily, and, you know, ask away. But I'm gonna jump to Susan Moore's question. So Susan has said, so interesting. Do you think you have done everything, or do you have plans for more research?
Oh, we definitely have plans for more research. Yeah, the exhibition sort of happened because there was an anniversary. So yeah, we are not at the end of our research. And actually I can see a question in the chat about, have any records been found from Europe? So this is definitely something that's on our list. We do have, we have a letter from the Pope, because those documents have sort of been collected. But we're sure that there were documents that we have, talking about trade with Lubeck and with Norway and lots of places. So we're pretty sure that there must be corresponding documents in other archives, but the question is finding them, particularly because it's not a place that survives. It's likely that its catalogue, because its name was written differently in lots of different ways, and so it won't necessarily have a sort of corresponding modern tag to find it by. But yeah, that's on our list of tasks.
Excellent. And I'm actually going to take chair's privilege right now. I've seen some comments, so we'll read them out. They're very positive. But actually what you just said, Emily, brings me on to my question. So kind of as a medievalist and as an archivist, I really appreciated seeing all the lovely TNA documents that you've been working on with Catherine. And obviously, you've already touched upon this, but I did wonder whether, and I'm thinking very much about the kind of Beyond 2022 project that Paul is involved with, and kind of thinking about the documents between archives, how these interact, how these overlap. If during the process you found any overlap between these records at TNA, any records at local archives, or if looking at archives in Europe as well as archives more locally in the area, you know, kind of the local record offices on the cards, or yeah, if you've kind of looked at that, I just find it really interesting to think about how different collections interact and kind of speak to each other.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, so I started by going to the Hull History Centre archive, which does have most of the, well, not the manorial accounts. Well, actually, no, some of them. It does have a lot of these documents that have all been translated and transcribed by Victorians because they were involved in this court case. And so that was a sort of mine of information, but it is all the same documents. So they've been really useful for us because we can kind of more quickly read those and then find the corresponding ones in the National Archives. And Kath has also been finding sort of extra ones that weren't part of that collection. But yeah, that's very much a sort of replication. And I'm really interested in the sort of history of how they came to be there. How come, you know, in the 1860s, landholding rights in the 1270s were suddenly sort of legally important. That's a, you know, an interesting story in itself. In terms of, sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Kind of how these archives sort of, yeah, speak to each other, thinking about that kind of interconnectedness and the overlap between the stories that you're seeing at TNA and whether there's a kind of any corresponding documents, whether, that.
Well, so yeah, one of the things that I sort of keep having a look for, and I've not got anywhere yet, is I'm pretty sure there must be stuff in the Lincolnshire archives. You know, Grimsby has been complaining they must have archives for that, and there's nothing sort of jumping out at me from the catalogue, but I need to basically go and have a sort of dig around and everything from the right date and see what I can find.
Excellent. I'm just going to read out some of the comments in the chat because they're really positive. You know, Sarah Pettifer said, knowing the area well, this was fascinating. Thank you. We've got a comment from Catherine Ryan. Again, very interesting talk. Thank you very much. I mean, I found it absolutely fascinating. I'm going to give people a little bit more time to pop questions in the Q&A, but I'm just going to have a scan of the chat to see if anything else has come in. I mean, we've got from Lisbeth, Sherlock, and Emily. I don't know if you want to comment on this, where she said, very interesting. Are you the Viking naming / connection? You're probably aware of a place in Denmark called, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, so I'm really sorry. Ravenser Odd. It is a spit very similar to what you were describing. And they've provided the Wikipedia page. So Emily, I don't know if you want to comment.
Yeah, no, we hadn't come across that. So that's really interesting. So the kind of place name stuff I didn't get into in this talk, but I think is really interesting because there's obviously this pre-existing place called Ravenser, which was sort of on the mainland, becomes known as Old Ravenser, and people have sort of been very keen to see that as a sort of Viking kind of place name. So taken from like Hrafen air, so like Raven's tongue maybe, although that seems to be a sort of Victorian addition. It's not. It's sort of said to be in a contemporary saga, but it's not. When you look, the bit in brackets has been inserted by the Victorians, but it could be translated as that. But what we've been thinking about is that the odd bit could be linked to a sort of Norse sort of language connection, as you say, meaning a kind of spit or a sort of point of land. But we're thinking it's quite late for that. Like, you know, this is a town that seems to appear in like the 1230s. There's no reason why it would necessarily have a sort of Viking name. And actually, if it did, that would be quite interesting in and of itself. So we've also been looking at sort of Middle English names, what sort of words. So, you know, one of the ideas is that actually the first time it appears in the records that we have, it's called Ravenser Odd with a T on the end. And so, you know, that, which meant kind of Ott, like out at sea. So it could be Ravenser out at sea. There's also times when it appears in the just as Lod, particularly in the local, or only in the local manorial accounts. And Kath suggested that Lod was linked to a sort of Middle English word that had associations with kind of pilotage on the sea. So it could be to do with sort of navigating the sandbanks in a way that would sort of make sense locally. But that name never appears in the sort of central kind of national records. So there's these sort of interesting slippages between different names. But that is a really interesting one that I hadn't come across. So I will definitely look that up. Thank you.
And Emily, actually what you've been saying links on really nice to a question that we've been asked in the Q&A by Sarah. So she said, the name is interesting. I wonder if there's any link with Ravenscar further up the coast.
Yeah, so as far as I know, I think Ravenser was only named in the 19th century. So it might, I suppose, have taken its name from that, but I don't think so. There are other sort of Ravens places as well, Ravensdale, that we need to look at, but I don't think there's any direct connection there.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to jump to the chat because Catherine War has just asked us a question, and she's asked, has the folklore surrounding the island been absorbed / adapted into the story of the lost town of Semawater or variants of it, where a town is drowned under a lake as punishment? Are there any local versions of a story involving it?
Yeah, so I have come across this in one place, which is a sort of folklore podcast, which I think was from maybe 2020-ish, where it was called Yorkshire's Atlantis, and it told both of these stories next to each other. But I mean, I suppose one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is that there don't really seem to be any sort of folklore stories circulating about this very much at all, beyond these sort of history blogs and stuff that I've mentioned. So I mean, there may be, and I'm keen to find them if there are. That's sort of what I'm on the trail of. But so far, I've not really found any of that kind of stuff.
Hopefully, something might come up, which would be very exciting.
That would be.
Right, I'm gonna again give people some time for questions, either chat, Q&A. But Emily, I am gonna ask you another question again. This kind of thinking sort of more from a heritage perspective. Absolutely great to see the exhibition, see people going, enjoying it. I just wondered, because obviously it coincides with the anniversary, and you said it's on until can't remember, but
At the end of May.
yeah. So I just wondered if, and I'm just kind of thinking in terms of, for example, people who can't go see the exhibition in person, they're not in the location, if there's any way of experiencing it digitally, if you're going to sort of try to capture it in that way for parts of the exhibition to be able to be viewed at a later date. So I just wondered, from a kind of digital point of view, and for people to kind of continue enjoying those stories and kind of experiencing these histories, if you have any plans like that.
Yeah, I mean, not for anything sort of very high tech. I think we're probably going to make a sort of PDF that could go on the History Centre website, which would be it's sort of like an exhibition catalogue. There's also a comic book, which the local artist who I mentioned with the sort of recreations of Ravenser Odd, he has been making a comic book for the exhibition, which is partly about sort of recovering different kind of folklores and stuff, which will be available digitally as well. Yeah, someone's asked, can we be sure it didn't exist pre the 1230s? So this is a question I keep coming back to. I mean, no one has ever suggested that it might have existed pre 1230s, but the dates are quite weird, and they do kind of like jump around. So they often keep saying sort of, 40 years ago or more, and then 20 years later they say 40 years ago or more. So yeah, I think the dates are quite weird, and I would be very open to finding ideas that it existed before that.
Oh,
Sorry, Danny, I shouldn't have been just sort of jumping into the chat.
Oh, no, go ahead, like jump into the chat as all you want. That is great as well. I was just going to say, a question has popped up in the Q&A from Sue Shaw, and she asks, is it possible that the decline of a town happened over a period of time, so that material from it, including building stone, could be salvaged and reused on the mainland, or is this inconsistent with the documentary evidence?
No, I think that's very consistent with the documentary evidence. So one of the sort of recent kind of folklore stories that has been gathering around this is that the whole town was sort of wiped out in this big storm of 1362, the kind of great drowning of men, which did kill loads of people across Northern Europe. But it doesn't seem to sort of that, I don't think that is the case here. I think people had already left. And it possibly did wipe away, anything that was remaining at that point. But yeah, what we have is like throughout the sort of 1340s, 1350s, all these reports of like, people are leaving, we can't pay our taxes because they're going, because it's not safe to stay here. And yeah, there are stories of sort of people taking relics and stuff. So yeah, and that, I mean, yes, you're right about building materials. And there's a story that I mentioned that the abbot of the abbey is kind of instructed to gather up the bodies as well and take them to the mainland and the bell and everything. But I'm also interested in, are there candlesticks and stuff circulating around medieval Hull that had come from here? And we will probably never know, but it's interesting.
Yeah, most definitely. And we've had another question come in on the Q&A. This one is from Jenny Lister, and she's asked, was its end only gradual or cataclysmic, or a combination of both? And has it been linked to any known weather or storm records? I know you already kind of touched a little bit upon that, but yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, there were lots of storms. So there is this big one, 1362, but there, you know, it seems to there were previous storms. I think there was an earthquake nearby as well, and there's also a storm around the time of the 1230s, which is perhaps why people sort of settled on this as the date when it was created. Maybe it was created in a storm, because we think it was from sort of eroded materials gathering from further up. And yeah, I think it was, I mean, so the Muir Abbey records, and I don't know how much we should take them at face value, but describe sort of in several incidents, like one where the waters rise up around it like a wall. So I think there were some cataclysmic moments, but I think, yeah, it was also sort of a gradual chipping away. And they're constantly sort of saying, can we have more flood defenses? At one point, the king sort of sent some timber from his forest to try and kind of shore it up around the edges. So yeah, there's this kind of ongoing attempt to kind of salvage what they can, and to kind of shore up the town against flooding, until a point when it becomes obvious that that's not really sustainable.
We've also had, Emily, another question, this time in the chat. This is really great. This one's from Elaine Gavacole, who's asked, has any excavation been done on Spurn itself?
Yeah, so no, what the team are doing is they, and I am not an expert in this, but from what I understand, they are scanning the seabed with these kind of sonar scans to kind of build up a picture of what it looks like, and if there are any sort of anomalies and structures and stuff. And that big sort of salt marsh area that I showed you, they are going to sort of scan it, I think, but I think there are reasons why you can't excavate there, to do with like the tides and stuff. Like, you wouldn't have very long before you got kind of cut off, but also yeah, I think the salt makes it difficult, and makes it difficult to scan as well below a sort of certain point. So I think just physically it's all quite difficult. There was talk at one point of sort of divers, but I think that again, it's quite kind of tumultuous, and I think quite dangerous. So yeah, no, there hasn't been. And as I said, in the 50s, the War Office acquired Spurn Point and did say to the Deserted Medieval Villages archaeology group, do you want to do some excavation before it all changes again? And they were like, no, I don't think we do.
No, I did not. From what you said, I do not blame them. It doesn't look like we've got any more questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So I'm going to start wrapping things up. And yeah, Emily, thank you so much for a brilliant talk. I've immensely enjoyed that, and I've learned so much. And I'm very, very excited for more of our Historic Towns Trust talks. So to those here tonight, we've got a few things coming up. Next week on Tuesday, the 23rd at 7 p.m, we've got our next talk as part of our partnership with Historic Towns Trust. The talk is about mapping female perpetrated murder in medieval English towns. We hope to see you there. And then next month on the 16th at 7 p.m, we've got our BLH annual general meeting, which we hope that you can join us for. And one of our highlights of the AGM is John Chandler's talk on decoding towns, how to write a history of an unfashionable town, which is really exciting. John is absolutely amazing, so please do come along to our AGM and enjoy that talk with us. And yeah, just again, Emily, thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant. And yeah, to our audiences, thank you for joining us tonight, and hopefully see you next week.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.